turn the other one on too.
Tell us when you're set to go.
Okay.
Our presentation today is going to be on Judaism, Zionism, Christian Zionism, and the impact of that on the Palestinian people.
It's an important subject in our time. The problem between Zionism and the Palestinian people is one of the resources that terrorists use to enhance their credibility and also to recruit new people for Al-Qaeda and these other movements, stemming from what's obviously an injustice toward the Palestinian people. And so it's very difficult to strike a balance between the existence of the State of Israel and the condition of the Palestinian people, and to realize that a lot of the Palestinians are, of course, Orthodox Christians or Eastern Rite Catholic Christians, and to get a better perspective of the Palestinians themselves, as well as the problems of the State of Israel. And what do you see as any particular critical point that needs to be made in this conflict?
Well, I think there's a series of distinctions that have to be made that go right back to the very roots of the problem itself, which is the Bible. Mm-hmm. And what you have in the Bible, you have two different understandings within the Jewish soul itself in terms of what it means to be Jewish, the relationship of the Jews to land, to covenant, to ethics, to other people. And what we could, in a brief, we could summarize the difference between prophetic Judaism and a much more hawkish, aggressive Judaism. Mm-hmm. And so you get these two different understandings built right into the genetic code of the Jewish people. So, for example, you'll get in the what we call the Jewish Bible, or from a Christian perspective, the Old Testament, one notion that God has chosen the Jewish people. He has chosen them to have a specific area or plot of land in the world. And at a certain point, they are to go into that land and take it from other people who have inhabited that land and are living there. So the whole sort of covenant with Abraham, I have chosen you, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, this whole tradition, and then Moses leading them into this land. And then the very aggressive policy of Joshua, the invasion, the obliterating of people, believing that God has sanctified, God has guided, God is empowering these particular people to go in. And so this whole tradition within Judaism, that God has chosen, given them land, and as a result they can do what they want with any other people based on a divine sanction. You have the other tradition within Judaism, what we would call the prophetic tradition, which raises the bar to a much higher ethical level, in which God essentially in Deuteronomy gives them a whole range of ethical guidance in terms of how they are to treat one another, how they are to treat the widow, how they are to treat the marginalized, how they are to treat the outcast, how they are to treat the foreigner, and they will be judged and evaluated based on that Deuteronomic ethical code. And the last couple of chapters in Deuteronomy say, if you live this way, you in fact are going to be treated well, you will prosper as the stars of the sky, you'll have as many children as the sand of the sea, but if you don't, you're going to go into exile. And so the story really of much of the Hebrew canon is the story of them violating or betraying that ethical core or center, and then empires coming in, Assyria and Babylonia, Medes and Persians, Macedonia, and going into exile and then returning, going into exile, because they have not lived consistent with a higher ethical code. So to sum up much of the Hebrew canon, it's the story of these two paths taken, an aggressive, a hawkish tradition going in, wiping out people, acts really in genocide in many ways, sanctioned by an interpretation of Yahweh, who in some ways is not much different than Odin or Zeus or Jupiter, and another higher ethical code which says you do not treat people this way, you do not kill, you do not slaughter. So built within the soul of the Jewish tradition is this divided understanding of how you interpret God theologically and how you interpret God practically and politically in the real world. And it's from that divided soul of the very center of the Jewish people then emerges the dilemmas we face today. Now, some of the Jewish people will draw from the biblical roots, but we also have, by the first century, the Jews, the dispersed Judaism for 2,000 years. They do not have a homeland. And then, of course, the Holocaust comes along. And so a lot of modern Israeli policy is not particularly religious, what you call secular Zionism, built on the never again will we experience the diaspora, 2,000 years, being really the victims and the scapegoats in other states, or, of course, the Holocaust, which they lived through.
Yeah. That seems to affect other people as well. And I notice that a lot of our fundamentalist Christians don't grasp the prophetic aspect of Judaism. They grasp the political aspect. And although they're talking about the prophecy of the Jews returning, they don't incorporate into that the precepts of Deuteronomy, but only the precepts of possession.
Yeah, and the other thing is, and when they think prophetic, they don't think ethical prophetic, they think end times prophetic.
Yeah, political prophetic, really. And, you know, that also affected the Serbs during the Bosnian War, because during the Second World War, there was a Holocaust to the Serbs in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia. And tens of thousands of Serbian children were taken out of schools and slaughtered. And their bodies were thrown, sometimes they were thrown alive into mine pits. And it was just before the Bosnian War that some of these mine pits were opened, and the remains of the children were there, and they put grave markers over the top. And consequently, when Yugoslavia began to break up, some of the Serbs in Bosnia-Herzegovina got panicked, and they said, never again. So they went and committed outrages and real war crimes, because they were afraid and they were saying never again. So they were prepared to follow a madman like Karadzic and General Mladic, who were really horrid demagogues. But they got so much control over the Serbian people by saying never again. And I think that's what happens, that a lot of the Zionist movement wasn't really about ethical prophetic. It was about never again and political existence.
Yeah, and I think probably what it built within this tensions of the Jewish people, what emerged by the 19th century was the rise of what we would call contemporary Zionism. Now, the interesting thing about this is, again, it's a divided movement. There was one by the late 19th century in terms of secular Zionism, led by Theodor Herzl and many others, in that their position was, it's time for us to return. I mean, it was divided initially, should we return to the land of the biblical tradition or somewhere else? But the underlying motif was, we do not want to be victims and scapegoats of other nations' rages. Yeah. And it ended up, of course, under the Herzlian tradition and Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion, that they would return to the land that was articulated, which was part of the memory of the Jewish people. The dilemma, of course, was that there were people living in the land, the Arabs. And so there was this form of Zionism which emerged, which in many ways has its precedent in the Bible, in the aggressive, the Joshua